Welcome to the channel, Dr. Josh.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
So, full transparency, this is a little weird. I'm kind of like fanning at this right now. It's really cool that it's cool to me that somebody that I kind of hold in high regard wants to be here. So, thank you very much for being generous with your time.
I mean, this is the beginning of the interview, so you may not feel this way in a little while. So I'll bask in that while I've got it.
Yeah. It's funny because in our email exchange that we had earlier, at one point you said, "Oh yeah, I saw one of your YouTube videos or TikTok videos. I don't know what it was," and like a lot of people see the videos that I make, but I'm still somehow surprised when somebody that I know or somebody that I know of says they've seen my stuff. I'm like, really, me? But it shouldn't be, but it is kind of surprising. It's cool.
Yeah, I think that's the continuous imposter syndrome that I think we
Oh,
all
nice.
suffer a bit from. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, being like talking to people on the internet's weird because you don't go anywhere. You just connect with people. And so you don't really get the sense of that people are seeing it, I guess, in a way. A lot of people that watch my stuff, they probably know a lot about your work. They've read one or two of your books probably, but just for the sake of it, give us your academic, professional background. If you want, you can kind of go into the story of, how you came to be, where you are, I guess.
Sure. So I guess right off the bat, there's a prominent apologist. Sorry, I'm trying to think of a nice way to refer to him without actually saying his name, that likes to refer to me as a talking head atheist. So let me just put that out there, given that your viewers are probably very familiar with this individual, much to their chagrin, I'm sure. I am not a talking head atheist. I don't go around arguing for atheism or defending atheism. I am an atheist, but I think it's because somebody suggested to me, you should probably figure out what you are. So it matters very little to me in that respect. So what I tend to do online is try to provide reputable scholarship to people that are interested non-specialists. So and that generally deals with the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East. So my bit about my background, I grew up a fundamentalist evangelical Christian. I was saved from hell when I was 5 years old, and went to Mexico on a missions trip, and
Oh, wow.
when I think I was 11 or 12, but I was in church 2-3 times a week. I was very much I would fall under the category of what intrinsic religiosity, I guess is what they would say. It was very much not a, two holidays during the year or something. It was if I needed a parking space, I was praying and I was thanking God when I found that parking space. So I did that, or I was that uh, through high school. And when I graduated, I joined the Air Force. And while I was in the Air Force, I taught a Bible study while I got my bachelor's degree from the very prestigious Liberty University. And if you know anything about Liberty, you know that it's
It's the biggest
quite,
college in the country by enrollment,
is it
but
really?
but it's
Wow.
mostly online. Yeah, last I looked, I'm gonna fact check myself, but go on.
Uh, yeah, we have some great universities. Okay, yeah, you don't need to fact check me. So I I got my bachelor's in religion from Liberty and became a chaplain candidate in the Air Force. Got commissioned as an officer and started seminary. So I did 6 years of seminary and full time. And if anybody knows anything about seminary, 6 years full time, 12 to 15 semester hours, a semester. It was a big degree. It was a 126 semester hour master's degree. And, uh, I studied Greek for 6 years, studied Hebrew for 6 years, did Aramaic and some Syriac, some Ugaritic, some Akkadian, and really focused on the Old Testament. And of course, it was a conservative evangelical seminary that I attended, and uh, because I got it was a 4.3 system, I had a 4.21 GPA coming out, and because of that, and the thesis that I wrote, I was very, very fortunate to be able to get a spot at Johns Hopkins University
Oh,
in
wow.
their PhD program in the Ancient Near Eastern Studies department. And as many evangelicals that I have known do, I thought to myself, well, I already know Hebrew, right? And I don't get into all this historical critical scholarship thing about like Moses not writing the Pentateuch or anything. So I don't really need to be concerned about going and furthering my graduate studies with that sort of nonsense, because I know who wrote the Pentateuch. I know who wrote the Bible. And so what I did is they had an available slot as an Assyriologist. Assyriology, for people that don't know, is the study of the languages and cultures of ancient Iraq and Mesopotamia, so between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers.
Mm-hmm.
There were 4 specialties in the Ancient Near Eastern Studies Department. There was Egyptology, Assyriology, Hebrew Bible, and archaeology. And I ended up taking courses in all of them. But my first semester there, I deconverted from my very fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. And, I did an interview with Derek Lambert where I went into, I think maybe a year ago was the video, and it's been viewed quite a bit. And I kind of lay all this out in more detail, but it really was. I am an example of what do they call it? A non-resistant non-believer.
Yeah, I've heard that term a lot before.
So, I did not want to lose my faith, but confronted with the data, the interpretive model that I had as a fundamentalist evangelical simply was untenable. And it made me sort of reconsider broadly, okay, what is a model that best accounts for these data points? So yeah, I went through the majority of my doctoral training, not really caring an awful lot about religion. It was, I'm here to become a great Assyriologist, and I minored in Hebrew Bible because I had so much experience in Hebrew Bible. And so anyway, when I graduated, as I found myself on YouTube, and I was watching evolution and creationist debates primarily. And there was a fellow that I'm sure we all know named Aaron Ra, who was debating someone. And Aaron obviously is exceptional at like the evolution debate, but the person that he was debating was bringing up things in Hebrew. And Aaron was, saying, well, I don't know that that's true, but I suspect that it's not. And it was good that he suspected that, because it wasn't.
Yeah,
And,
that's a
and
huge problem, because people will bring up stuff like that. We know people that are kind of notorious for like saying, well, so and so's book says this, that, and the other thing, or well, actually in the ancient Hebrew it means, but, and you're just kind of like, I'm not saying you're right, but I can't talk against this, and it makes them look like they're saying stuff that's true, because there are very few people that can actually attack and approach those sorts of things.
And I think that's why I kind of found my niche here online. So I end up being in my area of specialization. I end up being a little bit of a fact checker in these rooms. So I spend a fair amount of time in Clubhouse, the Clubhouse app. Sometimes I come onto Discord. But of course, we have a YouTube channel, Digital Hammurabi, that my wife runs brilliantly. If anybody doesn't know, my wife is Bart Ehrman's podcast host. So she's, I think, far more famous now than I am, which is amazing. I spoke at a conference in Ontario in, I think it was in July or August, and they somewhat in jest, they were announcing, okay, we have Seth Andrews, we have David Fitzgerald, and Hammett Mata, uh, and they said, and we have Megan Lewis's husband here to
Yeah.
speak. So
That's funny.
put me right in my place. So anyway, but that's what I do online. Is my specialization is in Assyriology. So I wrote my dissertation on Sumerian literary and liturgical texts, but I have 15 years roughly of Hebrew and Semitics at the graduate level. So I will not refer to myself as a Hebrew Bible scholar.
Right.
I think people loosely will refer to me as that, which, I if it's loose, I try not to make a big deal of it. But certainly I am, people like Dan McClellan, Kip Davis, Francesca Stavrakopoulou, people that actually have their PhDs where they've majored, not minored in Hebrew Bible. I think that should be reserved for them. So
Sure. Yeah.
anyway,
I get called a scientist every now and then. I'm like, no, no, no. I'm a science teacher. I know things. Um, that's funny. So, a few things. I went back. I looked up the thing about the universities. It's weird if you Google largest universities, it'll say like Arizona State or University of Central Florida with the enrollment in the high 60,000s. But then when you Google, and Liberty University doesn't show up anywhere, but when you Google Liberty University enrollment, it's like 115,000,
crazy.
but only like 15,000 are actually on campus, I think is what it says. So
I
and maybe the university, or what is it, the University of Phoenix or one of those online, maybe they have way more. So I don't know, but a huge number of people are enrolled in Liberty University. We can say that for a fact. Without getting like too deep into, because I have questions related to this. So there are some themes and stories in the Old Testament that have been borrowed from other cultures. Maybe not the entire story like in whole, but obviously like themes and things like that. When you were still a believer, you went into your program and you said, well, I mean, I don't need to know more about the Bible. I know that, so I'll go into this other thing, sort of semi-related. Do you think, funny enough, though, if you hadn't gone into Assyriology and seen how much of the Bible was unoriginal, do you think maybe your deconstruction would have been slowed if you'd have stayed with the Bible?
Probably not. And the reason is, and I understand the question, and it's a good point. Maybe in another program, had I gone into like uh, well, no, I think even there is so much entanglement, necessary entanglement and crossover between Hebrew Bible studies, reputable Hebrew Bible studies, and the ancient Near East. And so you won't find a reputable Hebrew Bible specialist that doesn't know about the wider ancient Near Eastern mythological texts, the intertextuality, because it's essential to understanding what's going on in the text. And by way of example, Ronald Hendel at Berkeley, Hebrew Bible specialist, he's just published in the Yale commentary series, Anchor Yale commentary series, a Genesis 1 through 11 commentary. And I'm very fortunate to be able to purchase it. It's not exactly the cheapest thing in the world, but I am so excited to get it because Ron Hendel sort of in many ways pioneered a lot of the broad ideas and some of the specific ones about the relationship of the primeval history with the wider ancient Near East at a more conceptual level. As far as the polemics are concerned, so it's really interesting the work that he does. But again, I suspect that what would have happened is I would have been faced with the same material, at least at Hopkins,
Yeah.
and um, probably the deconstruction would have happened at roughly the same rate. But I understand why you ask.
It's funny you said John Hopkins, and I was like, isn't that where doctors go? But I mean, it's a university, so it's where a lot of people go, I guess. But
Right.
that's just what I think of when I think of that. Um, so how many languages, ancient languages, do you know then? Hebrew and I don't know if you call it Assyrian or I don't know what you call the language actually.
So that's always a tricky question for a philologist, as somebody who works with ancient languages, because I'm very well aware that there's a difference between knowing how to translate Ugaritic using, like your dictionary,
Mm-hmm.
and you got your grammar there and you can like pound your way through a text, and somebody that can sight read large swaths of Ugaritic. So, you didn't need to hear all that. That was more for the
Oh, don't
people
worry
that are
about it.
specialists for what I'm getting ready to say. So I'm very good with Hebrew, uh, Akkadian, Sumerian, pretty good with Aramaic, Greek, like Koine Greek. Um, I can work my way through Ugaritic texts. I had some Syriac, but I'd have to dive back into it to use it. Trying to think of others. Yeah, those are, and of course, there are all kinds of different dialects with Aramaic. I mean, with Akkadian and Sumerian, but uh, yeah, I guess those are the main ones that I use. I don't know Egyptian, and that's much to my chagrin
Yeah, it's
because I,
yeah. You
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 know, I
you
was
always wish that you could. Like I play guitar, and I just wish that I could play piano or sing, which I can't.
right.
I would trade a little bit of that for just to be able to do that other thing. Um, do we know how to how do I say this? Do we know how to speak cuneiform languages, or can we just read them? Like, do we actually know what they sounded like and how to read? Can you read them out loud, or can you just read them?
Yeah, you definitely can. The question I think is how how close is it to the way that they would have pronounced it? Now, there are, particularly in languages like Sumerian, I think there are more debates because Sumerian is a language isolate, so we don't know of any other language that it's related to, definitely.
Mm.
Uh, Akkadian is a Semitic language, so of course it's related to Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic and Syriac and Ugaritic and all these other Semitic languages. So, but without getting into a bunch of detail, part of my dissertation actually worked on the pronunciation of Sumerian
Oh, very cool.
inadvertently. And there are ways, obviously, that linguists that work in the field that sort of really dig down into phonology. They can ascertain things. One of the big ways that you can get at this is by proper nouns. So place names or uh, personal names, these tend to retain their general pronunciation, their general shape phonologically across different languages. So it's not always completely consistent, but you can kind of get, if you see an A vowel in that first syllable in four different languages, that kind of tips the hand that maybe that's an A vowel that you should be reading in the Sumerian when it brings it across. So there are lots of other ways that they do this. But yeah, I think that it's reasonably close, but certainly people do pronounce it. People can read it. I think there's just you know some flexibility
Sure.
on how close. Is that an I vowel? Should that be closer to an E vowel? That sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I've always wondered that for like really old languages when native speakers run out and all we do is study them and translate them, do we know anymore how to actually say them? Can we speak them, or can we just read them? But that was a great answer. Before I get into the kind of like biblical stuff and the stuff about Mesopotamia and all that, is there any like active current research that you're working on right now that you want to talk about? Anything you think is kind of cool going on?
Yeah, I mean, cool is an interesting term. So I'm writing a commentary on the book of Leviticus, which does that fall into the cool category? I mean, it does to me.
I think so. It's interesting. We can at least say it's interesting.
That's right. And of course, it has the Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, so you get the big slavery passage. So,
Yeah.
For no other reason. But no, this is, of course, Leviticus is the book that talks about all the sacrificial system, talks about the priests and the vestments. And so I think it's a really interesting book. Of course, it has the section there about the incest laws and laws against, you know, same-sex male-male relationship, or interactions, what that means. So that's going to be a fun section to write. But yeah, I'm working my way through. It's I'm probably at the halfway point, roughly. It's probably 200 pages now of translation and notes and commentary. I just finished up another swipe through the book through chapter 10, so I'm into chapter 11 of 27. So
Okay.
that's pretty exciting. The other thing that I'm working on is I just sort of came back in force to the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 3.
Oh wow.
And that's gonna be the third of three. So it's gonna be the final volume of that series. And I'm excited about it because there are a couple of chapters in there that I think are going to be of great interest to people that end up having to talk to people online like we do, or like family members at Thanksgiving who are fundamentalist evangelicals, or that want to tell you that you're going to hell, and that prophecy is great in the Old Testament, and why aren't you a Christian because of prophecy? So I have a chapter, for example, on the prophecy in general and messianism. It's a messianic text. I'm going to be looking at three big ones, at least messianic in the way that they come to us today. So Isaiah 53, Isaiah 7, and Psalm 22. So I'll be going in depth in those three and just sort of engaging with them. So that'll be, I think, an interesting chapter. The other one that I think is going to be really interesting is in volume 1. I have a chapter entitled "Did Moses Write the Pentateuch?" And it's essentially looking at all the reasons that scholars in the field don't think this group of 5 texts was written by one person.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really go into, so what do they think? What are the theories that they engage with? And I hear online quite a bit like the documentary hypothesis or the JEDP theory. And apologists will present it as if they know what they're talking about, and they don't. But they get close enough that they fool people. And so what I'm doing is doing kind of a deep dive first into scribal culture. What was the scribal craft like? Who were the scribes? What kinds of freedoms did they have in like Iron Age and later? And then I'm going to be looking at, some of the main theories, source criticism, and the tradition historical. So looking at, layers and redactions and piecing the text together, and then, putting another layer on it to redact it to make a different theological point. So the goal is to make those theories clear to someone who hears an inspiring philosophy online, talk about this is the documented hypothesis and this is why it's dumb. Like, is he right? No. And again, not I want to be charitable, right? It's a difficult topic, and so like it can
Yeah.
feel like you have your hands wrapped around, your arms wrapped around it. You really don't, and it's unfortunate. And so, try to present it in a clear way, and then show. And I'll shut up. Sorry, but and then show. One of the things that I hear apologists say all the time is when they talk about this topic, they say, "Well, these specialists, they can't even agree. Are there sources? Are they redactions? Are they layers? They can't even agree on what it is. So it must be Moses, right?" And
Right.
the reality here is that what those scholars agree on, even those that are diametrically opposed on the ultimate formation of the Pentateuch, agree on these core things. And those core things that they agree on are damning to
Mhm.
single mosaic authorship. So,
Yeah, that there's a tactic where if you can make people doubt 1% of it, then you can just dismiss the rest of it. It's a slimy tactic that you don't see it very much, but it's particularly amongst like young Earth creationists and stuff like that. They say those types of things, or they try that kind of strategy.
mm,
Okay, so I guess just getting into it. So your PhD is in Assyriology.
yep,
So you'll have to tell us what the heck is Assyriology.
sure. So, essentially, writing was first invented in Mesopotamia. So, if you think about where Iraq and Syria are, you have the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, you have Baghdad. Those are like big places that people would know. And that area, Mesopotamia, is the area between the rivers. And so it's this area essentially between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And, we obviously have history. I mean, we have, people living in those areas for thousands and thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
But once writing develops around the end of the fourth millennium, the Sumerian language sort of gives us this first our earliest maybe abilities to write actual maybe good history utilizing text, because now we have text. And so from they say roughly around 3000 BCE down to about 300 BCE with Alexander the Great, that's kind of the broad time span that an Assyriologist engages with. And essentially, it's just looking at the languages and cultures of that area of Iraq and Syria for those, roughly three millennia. And it's a fascinating time. It's a fascinating geographical region because, of course, you know, you can you're dealing with Sumerian, and if anybody has been online for any amount of time and or watched I think it's the History Channel.
Yeah.
You'll you'll see ancient aliens,
Oh yeah.
ancient, and of course Sumerian. It's a language isolate, so it doesn't have another language. Ooh, that's mysterious. Maybe it's because the aliens brought it down.
Yeah.
And
People say that about
you have
octopuses too. They're so different that they might be aliens. It's like no,
right. I
they're
mean,
just different.
why not? It's all a journey,
Yeah.
you know. So, of course, knowing the earliest language, being able to read the text, so the earliest written language, I think is a lot of fun. You can go to the British Museum, any number of museums, honestly, and see little administrative texts, clay tablets that are have the cuneiform, looks like a chicken walked all over it.
Oh yeah.
That's
I heard that the oldest the oldest piece of writing in general that we have is a receipt for a goat. That's what that's what I heard. Because that was
yeah,
that was what they found important. They were like, why do we they invented writing because they felt like they needed it to keep track of things, and
that's right.
markets, that's going to be the first. Before anybody thought to like have fun with it, it had a utility to it.
I mean, very, very quickly, we kind of know how it developed, which is really interesting. They had these small tokens clay tokens that represented commodities. Now, there's a whole developed system that Denise Schmapp-Besserod came up with that's been criticized by people like Paul Zemansky. But I think we all sort of recognize, yeah, that these tokens, at least some of them, did represent commodities. And what they would do is they would take a clay ball, a hollow clay ball, and they put, let's say I'm a shepherd, and I'm going to take 10 sheep from you. You're going to pay me to take them out and to graze for a set period of time, and then I'm going to bring them back. Or I'm going to take them and take them over to somebody else to whom you're selling them. Well, you give me 10 sheep, I'm gone for several months. You might not remember that you gave me 10 sheep.
Right.
So what they do is they would take 10 of these little tokens that represent a sheep, and they put them inside this clay ball, and then they seal it. And so I have to keep that with me. And when I come back, or you keep it with you or whatever, but when you come back, you break the thing open and you count, all right, there are 10, where are my 10 sheep? Right. That's sort of the idea.
That's so interesting because it can't be tampered with.
That's right.
It's encrypted. Not
right.
exactly, but kind of.
But what they did as time went by is, once you break the clay ball open, that's it. So what they did is they started impressing on the outside of the clay ball the shapes of these tokens. So, and then they'd seal them inside so that you could look at the outside and see, okay, I've got 10 triangle shapes here. That represents 10 sheep. Okay, so that's what's in there is 10 sheep. Well, then they realized, well, we don't really need the tokens inside anymore. And so they flattened out the clay ball and just impressed the tokens on it and started to develop these signs. And so that's sort of how this process developed. It's very rough, the way that I've described it, and sort of simplified. But if people are interested in this, email me and I'll send you some I think relatively easy to understand bibliography on that. But at any rate, but yes, that's how it developed, and that happened in the late 4th millennium. And so you start to get economic texts, you get receipts, you get these, tracking, you start to get administrative texts, you start to get contracts. And this is what's most amazing to me about studying Sumerian and Akkadian, is that when you think about people that study Greek and Hebrew, you're working with much, much, much later copies. And even something like the Dead Sea Scrolls are centuries later than when these autographs were put together. Mm-hmm. And whatever the autographs would be, it's debatable, but it's much later copies. And so you're having to sort of reconstruct what the older forms looked like. With cuneiform, it's written on clay. I mean, you can see thumbprints of the scribes in the clay. Like, they're dated. Like, this tablet's 5,000 years old, right? Like, and we know it. And so it's a really exciting thing when you're working with literary texts. And, I'm sorry, I'll stop being excited here. But if you've ever done any textual criticism, or you've ever talked to somebody that does textual criticism, and they ask the question like, in Romans 5:1, should it be, let us have peace with God, or we have peace with God? Well, if you look, these manuscripts have let us have peace, and these manuscripts have we have peace. Which one is it, right? Well, when you're doing that stuff with Mesopotamian texts, with Sumerian texts, you've got a bunch of copies from these scribal students that have written them all out in the same time. And so it's much, you're contemporaneous at the time of these things being penned. So it's a lot of fun. Sorry, I'll stop.
No, don't. But you get excited about what your passion is. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, I still remember in middle school you learn about Mesopotamia and the birth of civilization and the invention of agriculture and then writing and all that. And you learn about ziggurats. And I just remember thinking how cool it was that this was all going on so long ago. And then you start and then I think you switch gears immediately to the American Revolution. Nothing happens between then and there. And
I'll tell you, one of the most surprising things to me about starting Megan and I starting this YouTube channel is what people were interested in. Because of course, I thought the thing that everybody's going to be most interested in is the Bible. Well, I have a PhD in Sumerian, right? So like I thought, well, I should teach a Sumerian, learn to read ancient Sumerian for beginners course. That is like I don't know where it is now, but for the longest time, it was the most viewed video on our channel. Like we wrote a book. I don't know that I've got a copy of it here, but it's Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian for the very beginner. And we've got volume 1 and volume 2 of it. And it outsells all the books
that's interesting.
that I've written.
I mean,
Because people are interested in it.
if I had to guess, it's because I have no idea where you would get something like that that you don't hear about that. Whereas, like, the Bible, it's the most influential book in history, and it's not even close. And so, you spread yourself thin when you do that. Right. Now, there's always the worry, like, well, yeah, but everybody's interested in that, so the market or whatever is also saturated with customers, so you can saturate it with products and do okay. But no, that's awesome to hear that too. Yeah, you never know what the next good idea is. Like, people thought that was cool. I thought that was just like, I think that happens to a lot of musicians. They're like, yeah, our most popular song, if you ask us, we hate that song.
Yeah. Our most popular song was Bop.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas, oh man, what is that song? Hanson has a song that I really like. I know how it goes, but I can't think of the name of it. I didn't get what I wanted. What is that song? This Time Around, I think it's called.
Oh, okay. I really like Where's the Love. That's one of theirs that I really like.
I tried to Google it and it came up with Chris Hansen from that song. I'm not like whatever, but I think it's called This Time Around. It's a really good Hansen song. So look it up and then listen to Mbop for the nostalgia.
Right.
So switching gears, but kind of not really. So I think to myself, when I think about like the Bible and I contrast that with Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria, what have you, I think like everything in the Bible, everything happens in a pretty small area, south of Damascus, north of Sinai, east of Egypt, but west of, it doesn't go that far. I can't think of a town to name off the top of my head. But so, Assyria, Babylon, Mesopotamia, no, that stuff's all over here. They're neighbors. They're very close. And, the Old Testament, it's written in ancient Hebrew. It's not written in cuneiform. And you have characters like Nebuchadnezzar is in the Old Testament. I think Nebuchadnezzar II. But at the same time, I just kind of leaves me wondering, how did your work get you so involved in the Bible?
Well, I mean, obviously, maybe to paint the picture broadly for people, when you think about the geography of the region, you have these major powers. You have the major powers, Babylonia, Assyria, particularly second half of the second millennium, they start to pick up some speed in this period called the Amarna period. You start to get this great powers clubs. You have the Hittites, you have Mitanni, you have Syria, Babylonia, you have Egypt, and others. And the way that you get from the major power that was Egypt to Assyria, Babylonia, the Hittites, Mitanni, is through this thin land, this thin strip of Palestine. Right? I mean, you've got to go through Canaan, and so it ended up being this sort of a tug of war of this area. And so, because one of the things that you don't want to have happen if you're trying to let's say that you're the Babylonians in the first millennium, and you're trying to invade down into Egypt. What you don't want to do is march your army down through this strip, because you don't want to cross over the desert like that. So you want to come up the Euphrates and then go down.
Mm-hmm.
What you don't want to do is leave your back exposed to potentially um,
Like a
hostile.
separate. Yeah, you don't want to. Yeah, you don't want to be fighting on two fronts.
And so you what you end up doing is sort of securing control over these city states and these territories that are eventually developed there. And so if you think about how during the Iron Age and later, how Israel and Judah interacted with Assyrian Babylonia, they did so under their thumb. And because they're far enough to the west that they're not like at their at Assyria's back door or at Babylonia's back door, they're far enough away that they've got to take a trek, take a trip over there to shake their sword at them,
Sure.
and get them to make sure they stay in line. Anytime that Assyria or Babylonia, the person in charge, the king, was weak, or there was internal struggles or strife, and they weren't projecting strength out, particularly to the west, these small, territories, or these small groups over here would sort of say, we're throwing off the yoke, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to pay tribute, and we're going to band together. We're going to form a little coalition, and together we'll be able to. In fact, what we might do is ask Egypt to help, because Egypt doesn't want a strong Assyria or a strong Babylon or Babylonia. And so you end up with these alliances, or the other way around. If Egypt is coming up, and, well, hey, you know what? I'll go call the Babylonians over here to come help me out. And so it's a lot of this sort of, there's a lot of interaction, obviously, between these polities. And so, of course, as an Assyriologist, that falls within the geography and the time frame that I study. Now, my specialization when I was in grad school was during the early to mid second millennium BCE. So I worked in what's called the Old Babylonian period. And this is the time of the laws of Hammurabi, if you're familiar with those. And so, I had all of this background in my 6 years of seminary training. And then, of course, I minored for the 8 years that I was at Hopkins in Hebrew Bible as well. So I was taking Hebrew Bible courses, biblical archaeology courses, all this stuff. And so there was always this sort of interplay. But for me now, sort of looking back, one of the things that makes making these connections more effective or easier to navigate for me, I think I said for me there like 4 times, sorry, is, the Hebrew Bible was not written in a vacuum. And so when as you were mentioning earlier, when you read through like the flood story, or you read through the Garden of Eden story, or you read through the Tower of Babel, these all have cultural and literary contexts that involve the wider ancient Near East, and in many cases, quite specifically, those of Mesopotamia. And so knowing the literary tradition and understanding the Sumerian and Akkadian texts and how they developed over time has made this process obviously much easier for me to navigate and to see connections maybe that somebody else might not.
Okay. Yeah, that's really cool. So your specialty, that's before the Bronze Age collapse, right? By quite a few centuries, actually.
Yeah, 600 years, yeah.
Okay. Who do you think the Sea People were? Any idea?
Yeah.
It's
Sure.
like
I
the
mean,
biggest
I think,
mystery in all of world history. Like, who are these people that just
yeah,
decimated everything? And we probably lost so much knowledge because of that too.
yeah. I mean, so this is sort of gone back and forth, and obviously, to really get the best answer to this question, you'd want to ask somebody like Eric Klein, who wrote the book 1177, and I think it's just called After 1177. But I think most people would say now that, yeah, the Sea Peoples are a group that are coming down from the region of, Anatolia off to the west. And, are they coming down because of climate change, desiccation? I mean, again, that's something that I'd want to read through all the recent secondary literature on. But I think, it's relatively clear. Most people would say that the group like the Peleset, who are in the Sea Peoples, part of the Sea Peoples movement, are the Philistines, right? And they're, at least best we understand it, they're sort of repelled by Ramses III, and they settle on the coast, or in these, this Pentapolis, what becomes this Pentapolis of Gaza and Ashdod. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's, Israel Finkelstein has a phenomenal series on the YouTube channel Kedem, Kedem, that he's been recording over the past year with Matt. I can't remember Matt's last name, but down at actually over in Israel at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, and the Albright Institute actually is, I think, where they're recording it. But it's fascinating how he works through the archaeology, because there's a lot that has developed in the last several decades on climatology, and looking at, like, they're pulling cores from like the Sea of Galilee. They go down and they pull these cores, and you can, it's beyond me, right? The science behind it.
Yeah.
But they can look at, pollen
Mm-hmm.
in these cores, and they could say, okay, here are the plants that were really thriving, and if these plants are thriving, that means that, this is the type of weather that, that was on at the time. And if you see, I don't know, but at any rate, it's really fascinating. And so I think there's a climate change is a pretty big factor in all of this. And so I think what you end up with, I think the mainstream view here, and again, ask Eric Klein, super nice guy, love him to death. He'll come tell you, but I think it's a sort of a grouping of causes. Sea people certainly affect it. I think climate change certainly affects it, and so I think that's widespread destruction. But
That makes
anyway.
sense. Yeah. Yeah. And we're seeing something kind of like that currently happening in Syria. It's been happening for a really long time, actually. That reminds me of something that I've heard before. I don't know if you've heard of this. If you think this is junk or if it makes sense, let me know. But there's this idea that I've heard on the development of religions throughout the world, and it's that cultures where the climate is pretty good, like the climate is temperate, and they don't really have a difficult time with growing. Famines aren't super common. Those places tend to develop polytheistic religions, and the gods tend to be more non-interventionist. Whereas in places that are more difficult to live, and when you go to see like the ruins of Babylon today, it just looks like, how the hell did anybody live here? But thousands of years ago, it was much greener. But it's still, a difficult area. And in Sinai, where Israel and Judah and all those places were, and in Egypt, it's more of a desert region, and those places tend to develop more monotheism, and they tend to be more interventionist. And the idea kind of goes, when you live in a very harsh environment where there isn't necessarily as much biodiversity, you're a monotheistic God of all of this in front of us. tends to be a little more popular because there just isn't all that much to explain and in front of you. And because of the what can be a brutal nature there, this interventionist God that has very strict regulations and rules, and you must do these things and you must sacrifice because it is very difficult to live where we do, and you have to honor those types of things. That's kind of the idea. Is that a theme in this area that you think actually makes sense or not?
So, if you've watched me for any amount of time, you probably know what I'm getting ready to say. This is a specialized area in these fields. So the development of religion is not something that I specialized in. So uh, I probably won't say much about it because I don't think that would be responsible for me to do so.
Sure thing.
What I will say though is, we want to be careful about taking sort of these strict, I don't know, like evolutionary views or linear views of the development of religion. And this is something that I think we've just got to be cautious about that sort of thing. That it doesn't strike me as sound, but again, I certainly haven't read the secondary literature on it, but I will say that monotheism is not something that I see a lot, right, in the wider ancient Near East. And with Akhenaten, you have sort of a move. I don't know that I'm not an expert in it, right? You'd want to ask somebody like Maggie Bryson, who's a New Kingdom specialist, could talk about that. But at least you have something where we're trying to narrow our focus down to a deity for a period of time. But I mean, you really don't see that sort of thing, as far as I know, in that region, until Israel seems to, which or Judah seems to pretty late, seems, relatively speaking. So yeah, much more than that though. I don't know that I'd venture to. Yeah, my opinion on that probably wouldn't be terribly valuable relative to somebody that actually has some expertise in that. Actually, Dan McClellan might be a good person to ask that too.
He's a little bit less accessible, but yeah, he might know something about that. I can't remember where I first heard that. It was years ago, and it's like it's an idea of religions globally. All I wrote down for this next thing I wanted to talk to you about, all I wrote down was the flood, but this is probably the single biggest story, and probably the biggest contention between the Mesopotamian religions, tradition area, and the Old Testament. So I guess if you want to, you can just kind of freelance your thoughts on it. I have my own sort of like scientific thoughts on it, and I can share those after a little bit to see if you think that makes any sense. But yeah, who is the story of the flood of the Old Testament borrowed? How do we know that? And I guess just you can go from there.
So in volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, chapter 7, I dedicated to essentially, did the Old Testament plagiarize? So I won't go through all of that, but the flood story takes up a significant section of that chapter. And as you say, the reason is because it's one of the clearest examples that we have of intertextuality between ancient Near Eastern mythology and what we see in the Hebrew Bible. So there aren't many people that I know, trying to think of somebody, that would say that Genesis 6-9 is not dependent upon the stories of Atrahasis or Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, and that Mesopotamian flood tradition that developed around the beginning of the second millennium. So the question then is, what is the text doing? And one of the ways that I engage with this in that chapter, and actually I taught a course on this that is on the Myth Vision podcast, the MVP courses, and I can't remember the title of it, but it's like myths borrowed in the Old Testament or something like that. And I go through this as well there. But the big question, I think, is that once you can move past this fundamentalist evangelical viewpoint, which of course is the big battle that we face, right? Is that it's really fascinating to see what the writers, what the scribes are doing in Genesis 6 through 9. But let's, before we get to that, let's back up, because I think the big question that you're probably driving at here is like, what would I say to a fundamentalist evangelical that is saying to me, "Nuh-uh"?
I actually have, before we do that, and this, I think this will be important. I tried to say this earlier, but my microphone was muted. I hear people say this is literarily dependent upon, the other thing, but I don't ever actually hear anybody explain what that means. So does it just mean that, well, this came before that, so this story could not have been developed without that one? Or do we mean, because I've seen things where, like, in the Old Testament, they're literally using words not in Hebrew when they write the story. And so it's like, well, obviously they couldn't have written that story without taking it from over here, because it has words from the other language in here. So, do exactly what you were going to do, but if we could start with, what does it mean that it's literary dependent? I think that'll be a huge help if for nobody else, then for me.
My 16-year-old, sorry, she's 17 now. Gracious, I hope she doesn't hear me say that. My 17-year-old probably knows a lot of quotes from Seinfeld, but I doubt she's ever watched Seinfeld. The reason that she knows them is because I'm a huge Seinfeld nerd. And so it would be nothing for my daughter to go to school and say, "Serenity now, serenity now," right? Or to look at a guy and say, "He's sponge-worthy." I don't think that would be out of the question. And one could look at her and say, well, obviously you got that from Seinfeld. But that's not necessarily the case. You can't get there from that, because what she could be doing is getting it from me. And she might not have really any idea of the context of Spongeworthy, right? Or Serenity Now. She may have just heard me negotiating with other contexts and using it in a way that might be slightly different from how, Frank Costanza was using Serenity Now. So there are layers of complication here that we need to be clear about, I think. In the same way, if I were to say to be or not to be, or that guy has bats in the belfry, you wouldn't be able to say to me, "Oh, well, you're clearly getting that from this literary text," or "You're clearly getting this from, where bats in the belfry originally developed." There's no way that you could say that, because I don't know where the hell bats in the belfry came from.
Right.
And it took me a while to figure out what a belfry was. And so that's specialized language. And yet it does not follow that I had a particular text in mind when I said bats in the belfry. And the reason is that this is how language develops. This is how language, moves, and people negotiate and renegotiate with context, utilizing earlier sayings or texts and so forth. Now, saying all of that to get sort of on one end of the spectrum here, when we talk about literary dependency, we can be talking about anything from that, which is a story develops chronologically prior to a later text, and it moves through the culture, it moves through the cultures, and comes down in a different form, or maybe the same form, who knows, and it's utilized by a later text, there's no question that there is literary dependency. In this case, it just means chronologically, text A, the source text, came first.
Mm-hmm.
And we would not have what is written in source B, the receptor text, but for what we have in the source text. Now, that really, in these contexts, is often all somebody needs to establish in order to engage with somebody who's like a fundamentalist evangelical, who wants to say, no, this was handed down to Moses from on high, right? Because if you can show that you could not have source B without source A, and source A clearly came first, then that's really sort of in that respect the end of that discussion. But literary dependency could also be very precise. So one of the examples that I give actually doesn't have anything to do with the Hebrew Bible. It has to do with two Akkadian texts that come from the second millennium, the earlier second millennium and the later. The earlier one is called the Anzu myth. The later is called, what you may be aware of, is the Enuma Elish. I don't know if you're familiar with the Enuma Elish or you've heard about that. It's the story about Marduk and how Marduk gets ascendancy over the other deities and he kills Tiamat. But at any rate, so it's a much more famous story because it interacts with Genesis 1 interacts with it. I think most people are reasonably convinced of that. The Anzu myth, without going into a whole bunch of detail and boring everybody,
right,
is a story about this like divine bird. It's really, really powerful. And he is a guardian of one of the big three gods, Enlil, in the Mesopotamian pantheon. And Enlil has this thing called the Tablet of Destinies. It's one of the coolest names. So there's a Tablet of Destiny. It feels like it should be in. And really, I was going to say it should be in the Avengers movies, right? But for more reasons than this one, that it just sounds like it should. Because what the Tablet of Destinies does is whoever holds it can kind of control reality, in a sense, can control nature.
Okay, so we're in Infinity Stone territory here.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Well, in the Anzu myth, this divine bird who is supposed to be guarding Enlil and the Tablet of Destinies, he steals it. And he flies off into the mountains, and the whole world is thrown into chaos because the Tablet of Destinies is in the hands of this antagonist, right? And so in order for order to be restored in the world, we got to get the Tablet of Destinies back. But who is going to be able to fight an already powerful deity who has the Tablet of Destinies? Nobody. Hey, nobody can do that. And so different gods are approached to go fight this Anzu bird. Nobody says they'll go. It's too big of a task. And finally, this god Ninurta, who is one of the warrior deities, is approached, and he says, "Okay, I'll go do it." Well, he goes and he fights, and he can't win. It's sort of a stalemate. And what happens in the story is that as they fight, Ninurta pulls out a bow and an arrow and shoots it at the Anzu bird. And the Anzu bird holds up the Tablet of Destinies and says, "Arrow, go back to your thicket." And it controls the arrow, and the arrow can't come near him.
That's cool.
I promise that I'm not just telling this story because it's entertaining. There's a reason I'm going into this amount of detail. The way that Ninurta ultimately wins is he goes to another of the big three deities, Ea, who is sort of like the trickster deity. He's the wise deity who knows how to play tricks. He knows how to be crafty. And he tells Ninurta that while he's fighting the Anzu bird, he should cut off some of his pinions, some of the longer feathers. And when he does, Anzu is going to want those pinions back. And so what he's going to do is he's going to hold up the tablet of destinies and say, feathers, return to me. He says, when he says that, fire your arrow, because the fletching is made of feathers and it'll bring the feathers. And so he wins, right? Okay. There is very specific language that is used as a refrain in this story. And some of the language is, when you kill Anzu, you kill wicked Anzu, let the wind bear his feathers back to the gods to announce his defeat. Okay. Several centuries later, when you get this very popular story called the Enuma Elish, which ends up being the text that's recited every year at the New Year's festival, you have a god Marduk. And Marduk is essentially Ninurta 2.0. The story talks about how the goddess Tiamat plans to kill all of the other deities, and she creates another god and gives him the tablet of destinies. So you can already see, like, there's this kind of connection here with the tablet of destinies. And 3 deities are approached to try to go defeat Tiamat, just like in the Anzu myth. And none of them go. Well, Marduk volunteers to go. He's not asked, he volunteers. And when he approaches, at his approach, not at battle, not as he fights, but just as he approaches, the god that has the tablet of destinies, called Kingu, he's defeated. Just at Marduk's approach, he's defeated. He's out of the picture. So, and you can see shared language in this story. For example, one of the phrases that comes up is, let the wind bear not his feathers, but let it bear Tiamat's blood back to the god. So it's the same phrase that's used, except it says blood instead of feathers, because Tiamat has her arteries cut open. Excuse me, so the feathers thing wouldn't work. She's a sea goddess. Anyway, there are these kinds of connections that you see, not just in the broad story, which is clear, but actually in this specialized language, this shared language. And the point that's being made, I promise I'll stop here, but the point that's being made here is there's direct dependency. That the person that's putting the Enuma Elish together, we knows about this story. Mm-hmm. There are far too many connections to say that there's, like by happenstance that they just have this. It's I think most people would say direct dependence. In other words, they know of this Anzu myth, and he's reworking it to make a theological point that Marduk is so strong, he doesn't even have to fight the enemy that has the tablet of destinies. He just has to approach. He doesn't have to use trickery and craftiness. He's that strong. So that's sort of the other end of the spectrum, I think, here, when we think about these two ways that you could think about dependency. And I think when you're looking at the flood story, there is shared language that is very out of place in the Hebrew Bible. Some of the lexicography, some of the lexemes, the words that are used are words that don't really fit in well in the Hebrew.
Yeah. But
they're used in the Akkadian texts, and they're very common in the Akkadian text. And so the question then is, and I'll land here, sorry. In the same way that once we identified that the Anzu myth is being borrowed, being utilized, and reworked in the Enuma Elish, the question then was, why? What's the theological point that's being made by the writer who's utilizing this earlier text. This is the question that scholars ask of the flood story. All right, we can see these connections. We can see this dependency. Why are they doing that? What's the point? And one of the big ones that we see, this is where I'll land, I'm so sorry,
No, don't worry about it.
is when you read the Atrahasis story of the flood, or when you read Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, the god that sends the flood, Enlil, is called evil or wicked for having done so. It's a rash decision that he makes. And everybody thinks that was a really bad move by the time you get to the end of the story. And there's another god that has to come to the rescue of humanity. And that is the god Ea, same god from the Anzu myth. In the biblical text, you have the same story, the same plot, right? You have humanity, they get all wiped out by the god, except for this.
It's a little bit flipped though, because the flood was to cleanse the mistake of creating.
Exactly.
I don't know if God. Well, he kind of says, "I regret creating humanity," but he's able to find one family that is righteous. So it's I see the same thing there. It's just kind of flipped the order and the reason.
But this is the material theological point, right? Because anybody that knows the flood story, which ostensibly these people that were writing the flood account did, and the audience for it did, they would be thinking, well, wait a minute, it's the flood story. Like, that God is wicked that sent the flood. This is why Genesis 6 goes to such great lengths to say, at that time, all, I'm trying to remember exactly how it says it, but all of the thoughts and intents of their heart were only wicked continually.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that the God that sends the flood is wicked or evil or rash. He has to do it. And he is at the same time the deity that saves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not two deities, one bad, one good. It's the same deity who's just in doing it and yet preserves life. He plays both roles. So
yes. I was kind of thinking about that. They can't have their God do something bad because it's their only one. They don't have a fall guy God. Although, from what I hear, it's very arguable to what extent Hebrews believed in multiple gods. It seems like they almost certainly did. But their God, they exalted above all others. So they weren't going to say that our God did the bad thing.
To be very clear, there is a difference between ancient Israelite religion, like the religion that was on the ground, and the religion that we see developed in the Hebrew Bible. Those are very often distinct things. And if people are interested in reading about that, Ted Lewis, one of my former professors up at Hopkins, taught Hebrew Bible up there, brilliant work called On the Origin and Character of God. It's a massive tome, but it's about ancient Israelite religion, and he really knocks it out of the park. So anyway,
I thought of several things while you're saying all that, which like about literary dependency. One of the first things I thought of was just how many things. I just learned about this the other day. It was like a YouTube video, but this person goes over, do you have any idea how many of the things we say in English have to do with sailing? I was like, I don't know, like a couple. They're like, no. A slush fund, fathom, all hands on deck, give a wide berth, by and large, batten down the hatches. That guy's a loose cannon. We need to cut and run, 3 sheets to the wind. And I was like, so like a huge number of things. And it's just funny how parts of language get borrowed from things like that. And then the part about the like specific use of the language. Do you know how they caught the Unabomber? So he demanded that I think it was either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. I think he demanded a bunch of places publish his manifesto. And they did because they wanted him to stop mailing bombs to professors at universities and stuff. But in his book, he uses this, or his manifesto, he uses this really particular phrase. He doesn't say, have your cake and eat it too. He says, eat your cake and have it too. Because to him, he thought it actually it's more of a contradiction to say you're going to eat cake and have it at the same time. So that's how he said it. And the Unabomber, his brother, read it and he was like, that's Ted. Ted's the only person I've ever met that says that. And so his brother tipped in the FBI, and that's how they caught him, through that. And so
That's really interesting.
yeah, it is. For me, the most all I can remember off the top of my head is the strongest element about the flood that definitely references Gilgamesh is, sending out the birds after sort of the climax of it to, go and search for dry land or whatever. But beyond just that, what are the other things where it's like, no, that was borrowed from that too, and then we have this thing over here?
Yeah. So it's the case that can be made is down in particulars that might be considered boring. There's a term for a type of like pitch or bitumen that, Hebrew already has a word for that, but it uses this other one. And why does it use it? It shows up over in the Akkadian context for the same type of material in the same sort of context. You have the lattice work of heaven opens up, and the term that's used there is a very rare type of Hebrew word, but it shows up in Akkadian in the same context pretty commonly. And the thing is, it's part of a broader conversation. Yes, the birds are, I think very important in the discussion, but certainly like they're certainly not it. And I go into all the details of it in the chapter, but it's part of a broader way, a broader type of intertextuality that we see in the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11. Because it's not just like the flood story is the only thing that comes over. Now, it's very clear. It's probably the story that follows the same plot lines. For example, in the Garden of Eden story, you don't have another Garden of Eden story somewhere in Mesopotamia,
right,
that they're utilizing in the same way. That being said, there is all kinds of intertextuality in the Garden of Eden narrative. And so it's one of these things that, and the apologists will do this quite a bit in my experience, is they will try to separate out, okay, let's just focus on this example, right? So for example, I think it was William Lane Craig in his, I think it was his most recent book, I'm not sure, but, and so nobody should quote me on this, but I think that's where I remember it from. He talks about how in the second millennium versions of the flood story in Atrahasis and in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in those copies that we have, we don't have the birds. The birds don't come in until the Neo-Assyrian period, so in like the 7th century. And to him, that is a slam dunk, because if the birds don't show up in the second millennium version, which is not in any way a clear, something that is clear, in my opinion, because again, so much of this is dependent upon what manuscript tradition, like what parts of the manuscripts do we have. But let's grant it. Let's grant that the bird tradition doesn't get inserted into the story of the flood until the 7th century, right? Or the 8th century. Well, to him, he's thinking Moses wrote it, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And so that flood story is coming from the end of the late Bronze Age. And so that's before the Neo-Assyrian period. It's before Ashurbanipal's library. And so obviously the Akkadian story is getting it from the Bible. Well, I mean, that is so much nonsense. We have lots of things that in the Hebrew Bible are dependent upon Neo-Assyrian textual traditions. So the same sort of thing is done with the Sargon birth legend, which, you know, is very close to what you see in the story of Moses. Well, that's something that comes in the Neo-Assyrian period, as far as I know, as far as the manuscripts that we have. And but the point here, I suppose, is that an apologist wants to hone in on one piece. And it's a very good tactic, right? It's what, if you were a defense attorney, it's what you'd want to do. You'd want to go piece at a time. Don't let all the pieces come in, because if you can if you can get somebody to say, yeah, okay, that one isn't so rock solid, they can put that behind them and then move on to the next one. But when you start to see that there's intertextuality throughout, not just the Hebrew Bible, but throughout the primeval history, and it follows a broad narrative arc that is specific, I think, as a polemic against Mesopotamian ideas, well, it becomes much more difficult. In other words, let me give you the example that will be clear. If, going back to my daughter, if she went to school and said yada, yada, yada,
right,
but she said serenity now, yada, 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 that guy is sponge-worthy. You could focus in on yada, yada, yada. And you could say, well, you know, this is very common in the culture.
People say it, yeah.
People say yada, yada, yada.
It's so, I mean, like, really...
Sorry.
There's a commercial now. It's like for T-Mobile or something where they say it all the time, but they don't say those other things. They just say yada, yada, yada.
And so if you can sort of pluck that one out and focus in on it, you can get people to say, oh yeah, that's true, right? That way, what kind of a silly argument is this? But when you put it in the context of serenity now and the one that for some reason sponge-worthy, now the case doesn't rest so much on the yada, yada, yada. And there's a pretty compelling reason to think that she's also getting yada, yada, yada in some way. It's dependent upon Seinfeld. So I think the same sort of case is made in that way.
Yeah, I mean, without... It's like they think they're pulling out the cornerstone on a house of cards, and so the rest of it falls down. For some reason, you only need to demonstrate one thing is plausibly, not definitely connected to it, and then the rest of it all just explains itself. It's like, nope, that just goes away. It's not very rigorous, but
no,
but it's I don't know. What can you do? I think I know the answer to this because you kind of talked about it earlier, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you think, can you really understand the Bible without, I mean, I guess this is two different questions, I guess. You can think of it in two different ways for a layperson like myself, but then for a scholar like yourself, maybe the answer is different. So do you think you can understand the Bible without really knowing much about Assyriology at all? And then vice versa, do you think you can understand Assyriology without really knowing much about the Old Testament at all?
So starting with the second one, because I think the answer is much easier. Yes, certainly. Assyriology, understanding Assyriology is not dependent upon at least in any significant way, the Hebrew Bible, because so much of the history and geography are outside and I don't want to say unaffected, but certainly, I mean, Israel doesn't come on the scene until the 13th century. So, uh, there's a lot of history in Mesopotamia before that. So, as far as the first question, it sort of depends on one's interpretive approach. So, in the same way that I can listen to, I used this example last night in a stream that I did with Kip Davis and Mark Lucher. Yeah, I like the song King of Wishful Thinking.
Oh yeah, I heard that
And
part.
yeah, and it's something it's like super upbeat to me, and but when you listen to the lyrics, it's kind of sad, right? It you would think it shouldn't make me feel upbeat because I'm the king of wishful thinking. I'm gonna forget that my heart has been broken, and I'm gonna try to forget that, I've lost all this. And so if we were asking the question, can I understand or can I appreciate or can I draw from the song meaningful things without understanding authorial intent here, the writers, the songwriters' intent? Yeah, I think most of us would say that, we're not beholden to understanding, um, the phrase sitting on them or sitting on them dubs. We don't really have to know what that means, or rolling in a lack. Like Hurricane Chris, you don't really have to get all of his lyrics to appreciate the song, "Hey Baby," right? But if you're trying to get to a place where you want to understand maybe the cultural context of that song or where it came out of or the things that influenced him, then yes, I think it's very important for you to understand his intent, and that's going to take you sort of understanding his background and what's going on and all those other things. So I think it just depends on the interpretive model, the interpretive approach. So people that are trying to engage with the text on a more theological level, I think the more theologically you're engaging with the text, the less you have to understand that background in order for it to be meaningful. um, the more historical critical approach that you're taking, where you're trying to understand what the text meant in its original context, then I think it's very difficult to get at that without understanding this wider ancient Near Eastern background.
Yeah. If you wanted to you could understand the story of, the Israelites wandering the desert, falling short of what God tells them to do, and then everything that happens after that. You could understand that just by, reading the Bible and referencing the Bible and cross-referencing this is connected to that. But if you wanted to understand where the stories came from and maybe where some of the motifs and all that come from, you got to know the broader history of the region. That makes perfect sense.
It's probably similar to reading the Bible in English, right? If you read the story of, Joseph, and you read it in English, you're gonna get like the big idea, right? Particularly if you read it in something like the NIV. The problem is if you read it in the Hebrew, you're gonna run into issues because there are like two different stories there in Genesis 37. And there's two different ways that Joseph gets down to Egypt. And so you sort of run up against like, well, which one is it if you're paying close attention to it?
Yeah.
And in order to understand,
I try to keep track of that story. I've heard two different people discuss it and recently and I still can't remember any of it. It's like, did his brothers sell him, or was it somebody else? Who did they sell him to? What happened first, and then how did he end up? It's just like it's a mess because it appears to
the
be.
question that you can ask yourself easily when you read through that story and read through 37 and then read 39:1 and ask yourself the question, how did he get down to Egypt?
Mhm.
Did the Midianites take him? Did the Ishmaelites take him? Which one? And that's where it'll just become clear that you've got to do something either to connect these two groups together into the same group of people or yeah. But of course that's not the answer, right? The answer is there's two different narratives that are being brought together. But anyway,
Do you have a particularly like fringe Bible theory or like a controversial idea, you know, when people are like, give me your controversial opinion? Do you have something where it's just like, I don't know, I just kind of think like, what if, or maybe, or I'm in the minority on scholars on this, but I think that perhaps, so on and so forth?
now my answer is going to be very boring. Not really. And the reason is my role online is not to be the tip of the spear in research. I think it's very difficult for academics who are teaching tenure track positions at universities, have a full course load, and are trying to publish the next book and 2 articles that year. It's very difficult for them to then turn around and have the time and the patience to deal with dumbass apologetic arguments, right?
Right.
And to make the information palatable to a wider audience. It's very difficult to do. And I feel like my my skill set, it's certainly not unique, but it is relatively rare. And I think it allows me to focus on consensus positions. So much so that what I'm trying to relay to people for the most part is, look, let me tell you what almost everybody agrees on in the field. And you would think that that would be a boring thing because it's like, well, yeah, I mean, everybody knows it. No, they don't.
No, yeah, they
And
don't
it's
agree.
usually the dumb shit. Yeah, like the dating of the book of Daniel, or the prophecy of Ezekiel 26. Like you would not think these would be topics that people would need you to like flesh out, but you do because there are these key issues for people with a particular interpretive framework. And so, yeah, I end up, I think in order to responsibly hold I don't want to call it fringe, but a minority position, you're doing that. If you're doing it responsibly, you're doing it because you have spent the time as a subject matter expert, usually several years in that topic. You've read through all the secondary literature, you know the topic inside and out, and you've come up with a new theory that moves the field forward. And I kind of, in many ways, have to pick. Am I going to spend my free time doing that? Or am I going to spend my free time reading through that secondary literature to shore up what everybody agrees on and be able to present that in a palatable way? So that probably was an uninteresting answer, but
It's
I think it gives
it
some
makes
insight into
sense
what I'm
though
doing.
as an answer. There's already so much that we know that people are ignorant of or that is contested. So you have you have your workload already established. I just thought it would be interesting to see if there's like
Yeah.
this particular thing. I have a couple, and this isn't exactly actually. I said I was going to mention this earlier, and I totally forgot. And it goes back to the flood. So my idea, like we talk about, you know, is Noah's flood borrowed from Gilgamesh? Probably, but where does that story come from? And my idea I've had about this forever, well, not forever, just for a long time, is have you ever looked up maps of what the world looked like before during the last ice age when sea levels were really, really low?
Mhm.
It's really extraordinary. because the total amount of land that was exposed is equal to North America. It's huge. And we have these things called continental shelves. Not every, like Africa has a very, very small continental shelf for whatever reason. But some places like in Asia, especially the southeast, like where all the island nations are, that continental shelf is really extensive. And like there were entire huge land masses in the Indian Ocean that were close to the size of like Madagascar that are just now underwater. But anyways, people have, even today, around half the world's population lives within 100 miles of the ocean. That was probably the case 10, 12,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago as well. Might actually have been even more extreme. And I don't hold to any theory about like the ancient impact theory, like a comet hit the Greenland ice sheet and basically sea levels rose in a matter of days, hours, or years quite dramatically. I don't hold, but clearly whatever happened, the sea levels rose pretty quickly. And so you would have had for centuries people picking up and starting their life over and their civilizations being wiped out by ever increasing sea levels. And so to me, I think what superstitious people that don't know a lot about the world would have thought of back then is, why is this happening to us? People lived next to volcanoes because the soil was fertile, and they came up with these ideas that the volcano is a provider for us and it's a god. I've actually heard that Yahweh used to be a volcano or a storm god before. We don't have time to get into that here, but so they worshipped and venerated these things as an explanation. And when they got punished, they came up with superstitious explanations for why. We weren't pious enough, et cetera, et cetera. So I had always thought that it makes perfect sense that there are these stories that just people told as rationalizations for, well, dozens of generations ago, hundreds of generations ago or whatever, our ancestors went through this thing and we kind of forgot about, everything that happened, and it was destroyed by rising sea levels. But we've told this story to deal with what happened to us generationally over time. And that's why these stories exist. That's always been me as a science nerd. And I like learning about religion to try to understand something about the way humans think. And so that's always been one of my ideas. I don't know if any, like in your circles, if people talk about like, why do we have flood myths? Like, why that? Why not the myth that the entire world was destroyed by an asteroid? Well, nobody ever saw that happen. And we definitely did see this other thing happen.
So the hurdle for that theory would be, I think, the flood traditions in Mesopotamia don't develop until around 2000 BCE. And the reason that that's a hurdle is because we have literary texts throughout the third millennium, and that more develop, obviously, as time goes by. But we have a lot of stories in the third millennium, and none of them have a flood tradition involved. In fact, there's a text called the Sumerian King List, which you may have heard of. And the Sumerian King List, we have copies of it from the third millennium, from the late third millennium. Now, in the second millennium, the Sumerian King List copies that we have this flood story, this flood tradition embedded in it, but it doesn't have it in the third millennium.
Okay.
So the point, I think the point is, or the hurdle would be, you'd have to have people orally transmitting this flood story over the third millennium, not writing it down. And then all of a sudden in the second millennium, you get Sumerian stories about a flood and Akkadian stories about a flood, and they become sort of, maybe not central, but an important part of some of these mythologies. Is that a deal breaker? No. Like that could happen, right? There could have been some catalyst that said, well, we need to write this one down. But I think that would be the hurdle for
Yeah,
it.
that makes sense. It's like it sounds logical, but the data doesn't bear it out. Do you have time for one more? It's a
Yeah, I
short
think
one.
so.
And I lied, it's two questions, but it's short. So what's your favorite mythology or ancient story or ancient concept? And then what's your favorite story in the Bible?
So I really like a text called The Poor Man of Nippur. And it's about a guy, Nippur was a city, and it's an Akkadian text about a guy who he's down to his last buck, and he has this animal. I think it's a goat, and he takes it to the mayor of the city of Nippur to give it to him as a gift. And the mayor, people that were in authority back then, in the same way today, I suppose, were supposed to look out for the people under their jurisdiction. And the mayor, instead of taking care of him, like gives him third-rate beer, and he gives him like some gristle and some fat, and then like has him kicked out of the city. And so this guy, the poor man of Nippur, he stands up and he says, for this one, um, not injustice, but this one like offense, I will, I will bring back on you three. And so the rest of the story is about him tricking the mayor. Like in one of the things, excuse me, one of the things, he goes off to another city and he rents we don't know, but he rents like a chariot, and I think it's a chariot that he rents. But he says some sort of a vehicle, and he gets a box that's supposed to have gold in it, and instead it's got a dove or a bird of some sort in there. And he goes back to the mayor dressed in royalty, and he tells the person that's what it was. He tells the person that he's renting this from, I don't have any money to give you now, but when I come back, I'll give you double what you would have charged me for it. And so he goes back to the mayor as like royalty, and the mayor invites him in. Of course, this is completely contrary to what he did for the poor guys and makes him out to be the real bad guy here. And he says, yes, I have this, very costly gold in this box. And while the mayor falls asleep, he unties the box, and the bird flies out, and he wakes the mayor up and says, my gold has been stolen. And he beats him. He beats the mayor, and the mayor is so, mortified, and he gives him all this gold, right? And so he goes back to the guy and pays off his debt. And anyway, he does three tricks like that, and the mayor gets beat. That says he's beaten from head to toe each time, and it's a funny story, and it gives insights into, how they thought about it. But the poor man of Nippur, and actually, if you go to Digital Hammurabi, the our YouTube channel, we do like a summary of the poor man of Nippur, and it's a really funny story. But that's my favorite. And then my favorite Bible story. Give me a second, because I really like the story of Micaiah ben Imlah from 2 Kings 22. Might be 1 Kings 22. That's terrible. I always mix them up. Anyway, yeah, I think it's 1 Kings 22. It's the story about Micaiah, who is a prophet, and the two kings, king of Israel and Judah, they want to go to battle against this place from Ramoth Gilead and try to take back this land. You might know the story. I'm not sure, but
It's not ringing a bell
anyway,
actually, but go ahead.
it might here in a minute because it comes up in apologetic arguments. And they have like 400 prophets of Yahweh that are all dancing around in front of him saying, go up, you'll win, God is with you, all this stuff. And King Jehoshaphat says, isn't there somebody else that, like another prophet that you could ask? And it says, well, there's this one guy, but I don't like him. He always gives me bad news. So they bring in Micaiah, the son of Imlah. And Micaiah says to him, yep, go up. Yahweh's going to give you victory. The king says, haven't I told you to tell me the truth? Don't lie to me. And he says, all right, here's the truth. I saw in a vision Yahweh seated on the throne, surrounded by the rest of the divine council, right? Members of the divine council. And he asks the question, how will we entice the king of Israel to go up to fight and to die? And one said one thing and one said another. And finally, this spirit came forward and said, I will go up and entice the king to go to battle to die. And he says, how will you do it? He said, I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets.
Yes. Okay.
Because it's a place that it's clear that Yahweh is lying.
Yeah. I have heard this.
And it's such a great story because it talks, I mean, it showcases prophecy, right? John Collins has a great lecture on this, and he talks about, well, how do you get 400 prophets to all give the same message? Well, before they go before the king, they all kind of huddle up. All right, boys, what's the word today? Right? Let's all be on the same page so we don't get killed. And so then the lone prophet. Anyway, those are my favorites.
Okay. I don't really have any particular ones. I guess that I can give. I don't really have a favorite ancient mythological story. I don't read very many of them, which is to say I read basically none of them, I guess, which is kind of a shame, I guess. And then for the Bible, the problem with the Bible is I don't find it to be all that, I don't know what to say, like thematically rich. Like when you read War and Peace, like he will literally describe what the candlesticks look like. Whereas when I read the stories of the Bible, there isn't really a lot of, the scene isn't really set in many of the stories. I was kind of thinking, I think it's Daniel who is, or David. He's stalking somebody and he gets so close to him that he cuts his cloak with his sword. That's David, right?
Yeah, it's the other way around. Saul is chasing David.
Yeah.
And David hides out that is a really great story, hides out in a cave.
Yeah. And I
Saul
remember
comes in to relieve himself.
Yeah, I was for a while last year, I was listening to the Bible when I went to work. Because I had like an hour-long commute. And I remember that story stuck with me because I was like, I can actually see this all happening. Whereas kind of the rest of it, it's like, even when they're describing the tabernacle, they're giving all the details of it, but you can't really see what's happening it's here.
Tough,
but that story, had that, and so and it was cool. I could picture that being a movie where it's like, see, and he hands him the cloth. It was like, I could have taken your life and I chose not to. I thought that's good story writing.
Yeah, it was good.
Well, I think we'll end it there. I'm definitely up for a part 2, but if there's anything you wanted to close with, I guess we'll do that now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. If people are interested in some of this intertextuality stuff, again, I have a chapter in that volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, and that course on MVP courses. Any of the books that I've written, I think I've got 7 out now. You can just go to Amazon and type in Joshua Bowen, and they'll all pop up. But Seth Andrews reads our audiobooks, so he's got that golden voice. So I don't like listening to my own stuff except when he reads it. So that says something about his voice. But yeah, and definitely go check out, if you don't know her, go check out Megan's Misquoting Jesus podcast that she does with Bart Ehrman. It's phenomenal. So
awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. So thank you very much.